Harm Reduction as Pleasure Activism by Benjamin Shepard. From the book Queering Anarchism by C.B. Daring, J. Rogue, Deric Shannon, and Abbey Volcano. This text from theanarchistlibrary.org. In 2004, organizer Adrienne Marie Brown described the links between pleasure activism and harm reduction. Quote, "Some people think I've spent the last several years of my life working with raising awareness about HIV/AIDS, destigmatizing drug use, and ending overdose. But really, it's about breaking down barriers to pleasure. So I'm a pleasure activist." End quote. Certainly Brown is not alone in this sentiment. Quote, "I don't think we do acknowledge the pleasure, though. Not as much as we should." End quote. Explains Alan Clear. The following takes up where Brown and Clear leave off, considering the anarchism of harm reduction and the pleasure of sexual civil liberties activism, and their cross-currents. Both anarchism and queer activism have long challenged anti-pleasure ideology. Through decades of social struggle, the two overlapping movements have come to share an embrace of the insurrectionary possibilities of pleasure, a rejection of social controls and formal hierarchies in favor of mutual aid networks and DIY community building, the use of direct action, and a culture of resistance. Pleasure activism manifests itself in any number of these cross-currents. Yet the relationship between harm reduction and pleasure is anything but simple. Quote, "Take your best orgasm, multiply it by 20, and you're still fucking miles off the pace." End quote, writes Irving Welsh in his novel Trainspotting, musing on his romance with heroin. The passion for destruction is a creative passion, Bakunin famously asserted. Thus, the paradox of pleasure is often pain, as the characters in Welsh's novels soon find out. Still, this right to pleasure finds its roots in any number of expressions of sexual and social freedom, as well as the intersections between drug use and anarchist and queer movements. Often obscured, the need for pleasure fuels the imperative to reduce harm. After all, what inspired the movement's formation but a struggle over expression and desire? While drug use is often about numbing pain, it is also fundamentally about pleasure-seeking and sensuality. As such, it is useful to contend with their multiple meanings, viewing such experience as a vehicle for symbolic and creative play, as Kane Race writes, a space where new ideas and identities are formed. Quote, "Greater attentiveness to pleasure and its qualities and social dynamics may also provide crucial resources for devising more effective strategies of care." End quote. Finding the pleasure in harm reduction is akin to queering anarchism at its foundation. Harm reduction has long been recognized as a movement with roots in anarchist direct action, and there are good reasons for this. In the same way Gandhi challenged social mores to make salt, even when the practice was outlawed in colonial India, harm reduction activists have challenged penal codes to create needle exchange programs in the spirit of direct action. Such gestures of freedom are a fundamental part of anarchist practice. You may already be an anarchist, Crime Think suggests. Quote, "Whenever you act without waiting for instructions or official permission, you are an anarchist. Anytime you bypass your ridiculous regulation when no one's looking, you are an anarchist. If you don't trust the government, the school system, Hollywood, or the management to know better than you when it comes to things that affect your life, that's anarchism too. And you are especially an anarchist when you come with your own ideas and solutions." End quote. Part of this impulse involves breaking down socially imposed barriers to pleasure. Such thinking helped queers invent safer sex when the AIDS epidemic began. Direct action was also the inspiration for the proliferation of harm reduction programs around the world. Here, sexual risk reduction and drug use practices shared common cause. Quote, "I have often pointed out the importance of considering the essential role played by pleasure and drug use, even the most chaotic use, and its life-endorsing usefulness." as well as the need to draw on the parallels between the gay liberation and the drug users' rights movements," end quote, explains Walter Cavalieri, director of the Canadian Harm Reduction Network. At their core, harm reduction and anarchist queer movements embrace pleasure, autonomy, and self-determination. In doing so, they challenge core elements of a social structure bent on social controls. Anti-pleasure ideology, after all, has deep roots. From the temperance movement to prohibition, over and over, authorities have sought to curb the expression of pleasure or consumption of intoxicants. Yet few movements have built on the lessons of the failure of prohibition. The following pages consider some of the history of anti-pleasure ideology, as well as forms of pleasure activism, which have challenged this thinking in a safe, thoughtful way. Case examples from drug user, HIV prevention, and social organizing are explored. Through them, I consider core questions. How can we create an agenda to support both the affirmation of pleasure and the rejection of prohibitive politics? What would such an agenda look like? What are obstacles and best practices? How can harm reduction take up the issue of pleasure, linking understandings of multiple forms of pleasure with a progressive agenda aimed at rejecting prohibitions that support war and violence, rather than affect and care, pleasure and abundance? Anti-pleasure ideology. The history of struggles over pleasure involves an ongoing dialectic between expression and repression. While the Dionysus cults embraced intoxicants, drink, and collective expressions of ecstasy, the Romans recognized that these pursuits represented a fundamental challenge to power relations, and the Roman authorities sought to crush the cults. Yet those who embraced pleasure continued to find their way into trouble. Adam ate the apple, and anti-pleasure religious doctrine took a foundation that we are still grappling with today. Deep within his dissent to the Lawrence v. Texas Supreme Court ruling repealing U.S. sodomy laws, Justice Antonin Scalia offered a telling clue about the continuing phobia conservatives experience concerning the practices and pleasure. If sodomy laws are unconstitutional, Scalia wrote, then so are, quote, laws against bigamy, same-sex marriage, adult incest, prostitution, masturbation, adultery, fornication, bestiality, and obscenity, end quote. Few assume that any laws against masturbation were still on the books anyway. Well, not technically. But for those with a keen eye on hierarchies of transgression, this seemingly trivial topic takes on inordinate meaning. To make sense of Scalia's dissent, it is useful to look back to 13th century Christian theology, specifically St. Thomas Aquinas' categorization of luxuria, signifying crimes against nature in which masturbation signaled the beginning of a slippery slope, leading to sodomy, adultery, and bestiality. For Aquinas, and the rest of the every sperm is sacred crowd, masturbation is a sort of gateway pleasure, like marijuana is to heroin. It is not very dangerous in and of itself, yet left to the active imagination, it is capable of opening doors to a vast arena of possibilities. Hence Scalia's reference to the subject in a Supreme Court decision about sodomy. While one would assume Aquinas' Summa Theologica is not applicable to American law, given the quaint notions of the separation of church and state, its cultural influence cannot be underemphasized. However deeply flawed they remain, teachings on crimes against nature have established a basis for laws that continue to criminalize countless sexual practices, including homosexuality. Concurrently, they propel abstinence-only sex education, which fails to acknowledge either evidence-based practice or the complexity of sexual expression. The roots of anti-pleasure ideology stretch far and wide, from Aquinas to Calvin, Cotton Mather to Comstock. A puritanical streak permeates U.S. politics. When Republican Senate candidate Christine O'Donnell recently spoke out against masturbation, she was participating in a storied tradition. The Puritans famously condemned those who deviated from their religious doctrine and emphasis on work rather than play, torturing religious nonconformists. Yet there were those who fought back. While we hear a great deal about the Tea Party these days, in the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion, Pennsylvania whiskey makers tarred and feathered tax collectors who sought to tax whiskey sales. The founders had many reservations about the threat of the widespread expression of sexual desire and drunkenness seen in the colonies. Thomas Jefferson famously warned those in the new nation not to visit Europe, where one, quote, is led by the strongest of all human passions into a spirit of female intrigue, for whores, and in both cases learns to consider fidelity to the marriage bed as an ungentlemanly practice, and inconsistent with happiness, end quote. When founder of U.S. psychiatry Benjamin Rush was not busy experimenting with torture devices designed to treat mental illness, he railed against bodily pleasure as a disease of the body and the mind. Over the years, this prohibitive logic only gained steam. The 19th century temperance movement sought moral reform and the prohibition of the consumption of alcohol. The 18th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was ratified in January of 1919. The era set in motion a cavalcade of unintended consequences as markets for alcohol consumption moved from legal, regulated commerce into the providence of an unregulated black market, which involved illegal approaches catering to market demand. Violence and crime followed. What did not occur, however, was the reduction in the consumption of alcohol. By 1933, the 18th Amendment was repealed. Throughout the period, a queer public commons took shape in places such as San Francisco, where prohibition was not enforced. Over the next 3 decades, the welfare state expanded simultaneously with social movements involving labor, civil rights, women, and people on welfare. By the mid-1960s, these movements started to encounter a backlash over the expanded welfare roles. With his unsuccessful presidential campaign of 1964, Goldwater introduced crime as a panic issue. While it failed in 1964, crime succeeded as an election issue in 1968, and Nixon was elected with the help of his Southern strategy, which racialized crime, welfare, and poverty. Policy emphasis shifted to crime control rather than welfare provision or prevention. Nixon's election marked a striking policy shift and a new emphasis on a prohibitive approach to crime under a new war on drugs. Rather than provide services to alleviate poverty, the new emphasis was on criminalizing it. The Rockefeller drug laws of the early 1970s are a prime example. Faced with increased attacks on social movements under the new administration, a number of groups fought back. The Black Panthers organized a food program to support their community in Oakland. The Young Lords, a Bronx-based direct action group of the same vein, organized a number of forward-thinking, audacious acts of direct action aimed at cultivating a more responsive system of public health for social outsiders. In 1970, the group took over Lincoln Hospital. The group's list of demands included calls for Spanish-language translation for services, acupuncture to aid detox services, and a consumer bill of rights. Most would later become common practices and policy. One of the early members of the Young Lords was Sylvia Ray Rivera, a leader in the transgender movement. Rivera was also a veteran of Gay Activist Alliance and the Street Trans Action Revolutionaries, STAR. Much of the gay liberation impulse shared common cause with the anarchism of the era. Pleasure activist Charles Shively described indiscriminate promiscuity as an act of revolution. Through this organizing, gay liberationists challenged the social system, rather than embrace marriage, militarism, and law and order social policies. Instead, the movement fought homophobia, sexphobia, and anti-pleasure ideology. It borrowed from Wilhelm Reich's argument that anti-sex politics support the docile bodies linked to fascism, as well as anti-sex ideology. Such thinking only fuels abstinence-oriented policies, sexualized and racial fear, prohibitive politics, and disconnection from the body. Throughout the early years of the AIDS epidemic, activists grapple with core questions about the appropriate approach to HIV prevention. While some suggested HIV prevention should include a temperance-era abstinence approach that called for strict prohibitions of sexual contact, others called for a more humanistic, sex-positive approach. Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, Richard Berkowitz, and Michael Callan worked on an HIV prevention pamphlet in New York in the early 1980s. They recognized that if one asked gay men, much less anyone else, to give up sex, the result is usually anger. All or nothing propositions results in variations between hysteria, repression, and inevitable lapses. For many, a world without sex is not worth living in. Prohibition is often more dangerous than acknowledgement, careful expression, and prevention. In response, the three recognized that latex was a life-saving compromise needed. From here, Berkowitz and Callan built on the lessons of gay liberation to draft How to Have Sex in an Epidemic. The result was a revolution allowing for personal and political protection, and a cover for both sex and the liberation movement that dismantled the shackles around it. The lessons of the tract became core principles of HIV prevention activism of the next 2 decades. Get informed about high and low risk activities. Be honest about needs, desires, and risks. Meet a person where they are. Practices, not places, spread HIV. And provide safer sex information, condoms, lube, and clean syringes. Reflecting on the invention of safer sex, pleasure activist and ACT UP veteran Douglas Crimp argued, quote, "We are able to invent safe sex because we have always known that sex is not, in an epidemic or not, limited to penetrative sex. Our promiscuity taught us many things, not only about the pleasures of sex, but about the great multiplicity of those pleasures. It is that psychic preparation, that experimentation, that conscious work on our own sexualities that has allowed many of us to change our sexual behaviors. It is our promiscuity that will save us." End quote. Yet, over the years, the use a condom every time condom code started to wane. In a 2007 podcast, Donald Grove, a veteran of ACT UP's Needle Exchange Committee, reflects on this moment and its lessons for the harm reduction movement. Quote, "The mere fact that society disapproves of something does not mean it isn't going to happen. For me, harm reduction is about working with drug users where they're at, which means recognizing that lots of them are very interested in stopping. But until you can provide them with the kind of help or alternative they need, they aren't going to stop, or can't stop. Therefore, you need to address the fact that drug use is an ordinary part of their daily lives. And not only that, but I think where it becomes really particular and really special is that it's an ordinary part of their daily lives. It is highly stigmatized, something they have to do in secret, something they have to do with a lot of other dangers and harms piled on top of it by the legal system, in that this is going to impact everything else about their lives, which isn't stigmatized. We as a culture approach the impact of the drug use. We take the impact that those things have on the rest of their life and say, well, that wouldn't be happening if you weren't using drugs. What I keep coming back to is, but they are using drugs. When I was still in my early 30s, 13 years ago, I realized that we have a lot, including in the gay community, a big dialogue around how you ought to be doing things, rather than how you are doing things. And what happened to me in the back room of the Wonder Bar, after a decade of impeccably safe sex, I was sucking off a guy in the back room, and he came in my mouth, and I swallowed it, and it was as though I had been struck like a gong, and I vibrated for days after that, because I realized how much I had missed for so long, and how important that is to me, and how utterly erotic that is to me. And I realized that this was something I did not want to stop, and it was a struggle. I talked to some of my harm reductionist friends about it, but the way I learned to put it at the time is everyone wants to talk to me about what I ought to be doing, and no one talks to me about what I am doing. And I see that as the essence of the harm reduction approach when interacting with drug users who, for instance, need sterile syringes. So that's the essence of harm reduction for me, is to say, accept that people or work with people based on what they are doing, rather than what you believe they ought to be doing. End quote. Through Grove's narrative, one can see the lessons of Crimp's thinking intersecting the burgeoning harm reduction movement pioneered through the needle exchange programs, such as ACT UP's illegal exchange in New York. Throughout the period, activists came to build a movement around the recognition that abstinence is unsafe, repression unhealthy. As queer theorist Eve Sedgwick explained, quote, "There is an ethical urgency about queer theory that is directed at the damage that sexual prohibitions and discriminations do to people." End quote. Building on these practical understandings, the U.S. harm reduction movement organized to support the needs of drug users in the United States. A group of activists moved to change the way cities in the United States cope with policies such as syringe exchange. Like using a condom, harm reductionists recognized syringe exchange as life-saving intervention. Activists in New York's ACT UP committed civil disobedience to make sure clean needles were accessible to those who needed them. After arrest, they made the legal argument that, faced with an AIDS crisis, syringe exchange was a medical necessity. Activists started a public health pilot program with the support of the city of New York. Over the years, the syringe exchange would be recognized as a successful intervention. According to the New York Department of Health, HIV affected 60% of injection drug users in 1990. As of 2001, that rate was down to 10%. The Harm Reduction Coalition defines the practice as a set of interventions that seek to reduce the negative consequences of drug use, incorporating a spectrum of strategies from safer use to managed use to abstinence. One of the primary activists involved with the early syringe exchange programs in New York was Greg Bordowitz, who worked with ACT UP's Syringe Exchange Committee. Bordowitz reveled in ACT UP's ethos of pleasure. Quote, "Looking back on it now, it was a place you could go have romance. Well, everybody was in love with everybody. There was this intense sense of comradeship and closeness. We were all brought together and felt close because of the meaningfulness of the work, and the fact that people were dying, and people in the group were getting sick. It created this feeling, a heightened intensity. Emotions were very powerful within the group, and they were on the surface of the group. Often people would cry in meetings, or people would get enraged in meetings. It was intense that way. And also, that fuels eros, that fueled attraction. People clung to each other, not necessarily in a desperate way, but people found comfort in each other. They enjoyed each other." End quote. For members of ACT UP, pleasure was a resource. Yet over the years, syringe exchange programs would increasingly become entwined with departments of health, funding, and the pitfalls of the nonprofit industrial complex. Today, much of harm reduction is about evidence, science, linear thinking, positivism, collaboration with health departments, service provision and struggles against co-optation and funding. But where did the pleasure go? The plenary of the 9th Social Research Conference on HIV, Hepatitis C, and Related Diseases in Australia in 2006 was titled Stigma Pleasure Practice. Here, participants asked, why is it difficult to consider pleasure in drug policy and practice? What are the consequences for practice? How might a greater focus on the pleasures of drugs invigorate harm reduction? To start the process, it is useful to reconsider the ways direct action practices inform movements for social and sexual freedom, including anarchism, sexual civil liberties activism, and by extension, harm reduction. Quote, "I joined Sex Panic because there's no group making the same connections between the renewed sexual repression of the past several decades. The failure of the left to identify pleasure as a political principle worth fighting for does a lot to explain the moribund state of progressive politics." End quote. Explained Chris Farrell in 1998. Here, Farrell calls for the activists to, quote, return sexual pleasure to the progressive agenda. Until the left learns to function the orgasm, our fight against oppression is doomed. End quote. From sex worker organizing to parties celebrating public sexual culture, examples of such practices are many. Groups such as AIDS Prevention Action League and Jacks of Color have helped support a broader push for safer promiscuity with large-scale parties, which in turn support and facilitate pleasure. The late sexual civil liberties activist Eric Rofus rejected paternalism, while writing that gay men are far more comfortable and capable of embracing complicated choices. Champ's Julie Davids has used data to challenge public health panics, rejecting stigma. Through events such as the Orgasm Big Bang Party, pleasure activists have supported both harm reduction and public sexual culture. Quote, "We are a group of radical queers who are creating a space that is sex-positive, gender-inclusive, anti-capitalist, affordable, sex-positive, and feminist, where we can fuck, make art, engage in kink, dance, and play." End quote. To do so, this sex party depends on a radical definition of consent. Here, consent is recognized as the presence of yes, and not just the absence of no, with the understanding that everyone can change their mind, stop, or back up at any time. Consent must be established each and every time sexual activity happens. Through such endeavors, pleasure activists have taught us that without pleasure, there can be no justice. Throughout the movement, leaders such as Housing Works co-founder Keith Seiler helped keep the expression of pleasure as an integral component of harm reduction. Squatter Lewis Jones started Stand Up Harlem within the same spirit of anarchism. Quote, "That to me felt so incredible. You talk about emotions. I just felt such pleasure. Everyone thinks about pleasure in terms of decadence, but there is more to it than that. I was moved. It brought fulfillment. I felt animated. We were living together, sleeping together, and working for change. Yet more to it, using was dying with dignity. With dignity because it was my choice. No one was making it for me. I took a stand for those I knew who chose drugs when they were facing death." End quote. Jones recognized that when facing death, there were those who would want to cope in the midst of all that pain. He explained, quote, "For some, it was just to get that old familiar, this old feeling, relationship, lover, what have you. This pain relief that the doctor might not give, or it might not be enough. It was on your own terms. The liberty was what I was elated about. The choice without shame. That was what I was doing." End quote. At Citywide Harm Reduction, where I worked for 4 years, we grappled with pleasure as a part of a tragicomic continuum of human experience. When a member died, we said goodbye in a circle. Here, grief was transformed to a space for care, song, drumming, and happiness born of authentic lived experience. And members knew they had faced the negative, moved through it, and came out the other side. The tenacity of those in the circle made this scene one of the most pulsing spaces I've seen. In their daily transforming the negative into a new way of living, those in the program achieved a kind of magical power. In this way, harm reduction is understood as a place where members build healing communities, spaces for care and solidarity. Through such connections, they challenge the insurmountable, and they share lives and authentic experience together outside the prohibitive logic of criminal justice and coercion. Building on these lessons, one can come to see components of an agenda for pleasure, care, and just human relations. In 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, Freud rejected Puritan mores by suggesting that everyone has some form of perversion in them. There is no shame in it. This is part of being human. Yet shame exists and causes harm. To do away with shame and the repression it fuels, pleasure activists push to transform the social order. Yet to be effective, the process must include a respect for self-determination, choice, and pleasure. If we do not acknowledge the importance of pleasure, we risk mirroring the prohibited politics we reject. Without justice, there can be no pleasure. After all, what we are protecting is a right to social imagination that rejects both paternalism and positivism, while opening spaces for alternative social relations and ways of embracing experience outside the realm of the rational experience. The failure of the political left to articulate a pro-pleasure argument is nothing short of a failure of the political imagination. It leaves a huge void to be occupied by moralists. There is another route, one built through practices in pleasure, justice, and freedom.